G'day and welcome to another World of Warcraft video. In this video we're going to talk about, well, inflation. And it doesn't sound like the most exciting topic, but to me, well, it's pretty interesting. We're going to talk about how inflation affects World of Warcraft and basically, can World of Warcraft stop the rampant inflation that's occurring? So first, let's understand what is inflation and how it works, and cover a little bit of the basics around how it works in World of Warcraft. So inflation is basically the natural increase of prices. In MMOs, because they represent some modicum of normal human society, inflation is a natural thing that will occur. Quest rewards will drop more gold will enter the game's supply, and thus prices of things will rise. Generally, prices will rise because the game wants to either A, control the supply of gold that exists, and also B, other players want to get as much gold as possible. So those players will raise their prices to obtain more of other players' gold. Now we'll break it down into certain aspects just now, but to understand the concept simply, inflation is the reason why a WoW token is now 353,000 gold on my server, compared to the 110,000 gold it was when it first originally came out. It's also the reason why Watlick, for example, has a 10,000 gold cap on its WoW tokens, comparison to the hundreds of thousands of gold caps you'll see on tokens in retail WoW. And this is because the supply of gold that exists on each version of the game is distinctively different, and inflation has not hit Watlick in the same way it has hit retail WoW. And you might say to yourself, well, that's hundreds times or multiple hundred times the amount that you get between the two different versions. And this inflation is going to continue to accelerate as the game continues to fail to counteract its problems. As we go along in time, we will continue to have further large-scale inflation throughout the game as we progress. Now, of course, let us understand a little bit about how inflation works, especially within the World of Warcraft environment, so that we can understand how best to manage it. So firstly, you need to understand how gold enters World of Warcraft. Well, their traditional ways are basically quest rewards. Questing will provide players with gold. Selling items that they obtain from questing or from drops from monsters will obtain gold for players. This will introduce itself into the economy, and players will be able to use that gold to procure services of whichever nature they wish to obtain. Now, gold in its essence entering the system and increasing the supply of gold is not a problem. But World of Warcraft has two external sources that naturally increase, well, unnaturally I should say, increase its supply of gold through other means. And these two methods are botting, which creates rampant gold inflation within an economy, and also the WoW token, which was a method used to combat the inflation, but has merely aided it. And there's a specific reason why the WoW token does this, and I'll be covering that after we understand how gold exits the economy. But it's important to understand that there's several natural methods, such as questing, selling of items, and obviously obtaining the gold naturally within game. And there's the unnatural methods that could provide excessive gold within the economy, such as botting and WoW token. Now, how does gold leave the economy? Well, traditionally, gold leaves the economy in a very similar way to how gold leaves pretty much players' hands. Repairs, buying of items from vendors, buying of consumables, and of course, gold sinks are introduced into the game to help curb inflation. This is why you will always see things like excessively expensive mounts, the black market auction house, and just in general, basically, any form of in-game vendor or NPC that a player has to buy something from. Player-to-player trade does not make gold exit the system, and it's important to understand this to understand how inflation works. If player-to-player trade meant that there was a way to, well, take gold out the system, inflation wouldn't be so bad. But the issue is there's no unnatural method of taking gold out of the system, barring banning of players who have procured gold illegally, or through those players deleting their characters. Those are the only two other ways for gold to leave the system, and these are not very common, and or are not effective enough to combat the need for more gold to exit the supply system, and thus limit the amount of gold that exists within World of Warcraft. Now, why is the gold supply, or the amount of gold that exists in World of Warcraft, so important? Well, the amount of gold that exists within World of Warcraft is so important because that's how inflation works. The more money or gold that is available, the more people have to spend. And the more money people have to spend, the more players who seek that money will attempt to get it. And naturally, this means that they will raise the prices of services that they provide, whether that be BOE items, services for crafting, or, as some can imagine, progression within the game. And we'll keep that one for its own little separate section, but it's super important to understand that inflation will naturally occur, and the more gold you have, the more rampant that inflation will be. So let's talk a little bit about the WoW token and botting. So the reason the WoW token is such a disastrous method of counteracting the existence of the gold inflation and botting is, firstly, it doesn't really stop the botting. The bots just simply use the gold they make to now buy WoW tokens to procure cheap game time. But more importantly, the reason the WoW token is a disastrous method of containing inflation is because the game's inflation is naturally pushed rampantly by the unnatural source of WoW token money. WoW tokens are sold to players in game, but that gold is procured from bots who buy that gold, thus making the supply of gold unnaturally high. And the problem is the price of the WoW token remains the same. Although the current economic climate worldwide is quite tense for most people, the thing is the WoW token never changes in price. It doesn't go to $18.50, it doesn't go to $25, it doesn't change in price. And what this means is that players, as our wage and living expenses continue to grow, the WoW token continues to remain a static expense. What this means is it effectively becomes cheaper and cheaper for players to use real-world money, which is growing, in a sense, to the diminished value of the real-world cost of the WoW token. This means it becomes easier and easier to procure a WoW token, and less effort to procure a WoW token, and more bots are created, more gold is supplied to the system, and more players procure that gold through legitimate means, thus inflating the natural baseline of gold supply. And as discussed previously, the more gold that enters the system and the more gold that exists, the more that baseline continues to rise. And as that baseline rises, the price of the WoW token goes up. But here's the thing, the real world price remains the same. So as more and more gold enters the system, and as more and more bots procure more gold, and as that gold is legitimized through the WoW token, the continual cycle occurs whereby the money you spend procures you more gold in game. And this goes hand in hand with botting. Botting is the process whereby players basically create bots that perform rudimentary functions. Now this is generally to farm resources, complete quests, or even as simple as skinning animals and selling them to vendors. It sounds strange to say, but if you think about it, in theory it makes sense. If a character one-shots a creature, that creature drops a skin that is worth 50 silver, and they then vendor that item, that account has gained 50 silver. Now for you and me to spend 24 hours a day killing 18,000 boars to get 50 silver per skin is not ideal. But if you are a bot, you don't really care. What this does is this creates a huge inflation of gold. As mentioned before, one of the few ways for gold to enter the economy is through the procurement of gold via selling of items. Now, when you bot, although you are using a natural process, you are creating an unnatural amount of gold from that insignificant source. And what that does is that inflates the tremendous gold supply that exists within the game quite substantially. So now that we understand how all of this works, what is the big issue? Well, the big issue is that the majority of the player base is not a hardcore player base. Player bases for MMOs can be broken up into numerous kind of subsects. You have casual players, hardcore players, and you then also have those that kind of lie in between. Everyone has their facets of the game that they truly enjoy. But there's a couple things that create a system of unhealthy inflation within World of Warcraft that addresses all problems. Firstly, hardcore players want to have gold. Hardcore players want to have gold for numerous reasons. Mounts, gold sinks, like auction mounts, black market mounts, and also running their raids. It can be quite expensive to consistently supply a raid with the top level elixirs, files, flasks, augment runes, and those are all in limited supply, which means the players that provide them generally get to charge a high price. For example, the Draconic Augment Rune, which gives you merely a 1% primary stat buff, costs 3,000 gold. Now, to the normal player, this is an excessive amount. And when you have an entire raid that's consistently wiping or attempting to complete content, you need to go through quite a few of these. Gold runs can cost in excess of hundreds of thousands of gold. And, of course, this means that these people need to procure this gold. So how do they do this? Well, they offer progress. By offering progress, or in the classic versions of the game, what's called a GKDP, is basically the system whereby players who are not very good at the game may provide gold in exchange for progress. This can be in the form of beating bosses for things like the Ahead of the Curve achievement, or this can be as simple as basically guaranteeing yourself a drop. You'll often see in trade chat advertisements for content, clearing all the content, first priority on loot, and the reason why this exists is because it can be sold to you. Now, this isn't the sole reason for botting, and this isn't the sole reason for inflation, but it creates a cycle. I'll give you an example. As players become more casual, or a casual player wants to experience the end of game content, it costs 700,000 gold for that player to partake in that raid. He thinks instead of wasting his time spending the next few weeks learning and progging, he's going to buy himself 2 WoW tokens. This player is someone who earns a decent salary and thus spends enough money to get himself 2 WoW tokens, which covers the cost of his raid. These 2 WoW tokens are sold in the game to a botting account that procures both of these, or just to other players who are also looking to progress, or even to the hardcore players themselves who are using gold from other runs to buy these tokens. These players then obtain the game time. The player obtains his gold and he uses it to buy himself a run. Upon buying that run, he now realizes that he can get his progress, and the very players that either A, sold him the gold, in theory, or the very players that essentially wanted to get the gold, obtain it, the bots legitimize the gold, and now by having that gold in the system, the cycle then continues because all this gold increases the price, because now everyone has access to that 700k gold, and surprise, surprise, that 700k gold leads to everything raising in price. All of a sudden the runes are 3,200 because everyone realizes they can actually charge that, because all of a sudden the heroic players have a lot more gold. It's the same reason why in a very expansion, runs that can be bought, for example, go from 100k gold at the beginning to 250k gold at the end. It's inflation. It's the unnatural procurement of gold that is accelerating this process. And the thing is it's very difficult to stop this, as hardcore guilds very often need this gold to continue their runs, and the hardcore scene is realistically what keeps people aspiring to obtaining that level. But what it also does now is it creates an unhealthy secondary clause to this toxic inflation. Not only do we have increasing prices consistently throughout the game, but the hardcore level raids and guilds and these people that sell these runs are incredibly selective. It also means that the casual player base that can purchase gold and can purchase these tokens sees a lot less interest in grinding. This lowers the player base that you have available for other players to lift themselves to that level. So not only does it increase inflation, but it actually secludes the player bases that could potentially do the content without it being a sellable run, which means that players now have less players to work with, or less fellow players to work with, and by having less fellow players to work with, are more incentivized to buy gold and spend that gold on obtaining a run. So it's a very, 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 very toxic inflationary system. And this system is becoming incredibly capitalized on by the fact that the real world cost of WoW token does not accelerate. As long as the real world cost of WoW token continues to become less and less each year, we will continue to see more and more gold introduced into World of Warcraft. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that bottom gold, or that excess gold that's created to procure those WoW tokens, is legitimized and added into the system. Now, of course, how can World of Warcraft, continue this cycle? Is it possible for the game to just inflate itself out of having a workable ecosystem? And the answer is, well, yes. As players can see, or as players will notice, it does become harder and harder, and very often videos like the fastest way to make gold, how to make gold easily, the 5 quickest ways to make 100k gold become more and more popular as players seek more and more means to make gold without impacting their casual gameplay. And this is, although something everyone's always been interested in, starting to become a lot more kind of popular, because players are really just trying to make 200k gold to buy their next raid run. And this is the kind of ultimate end game that WoW will lead itself into. Players consistently buying themselves runs, and thus looking for means to obtain that gold to buy themselves runs. And if they don't get those means, the number one mean will always be buying a WoW token. So how can Blizzard combat this, and will they? Well, a lot of people make this kind of generalized statement that Blizzard are, of course, an incredibly greedy company, that they don't seek to remedy these problems within their game. And although, of course, there is definitely an incentive for them to consistently make money this way, I personally believe that the longevity of the game comes into question when you don't address these concerns. Of course, they may not want to. It's not something that I can guarantee. I don't work at Blizzard. But what I can say, at least from my side, is that the only way to combat these is to create more unnatural means, or more frequent unnatural means, of gold exclusion from the economy. Accounts need to be banned, characters need to be deleted, or more artificial external gold sinks need to be provided. Alternatively, they need to stop the means by which players can procure extremely cheap WoW tokens, or extremely cheap game time. Another alternative is to increase the price of the WoW token. To people who buy the WoW token, that's not great news, but it's the easiest way to combat inflation. If the WoW token becomes $56 all of a sudden, you're not going to see as many people buy it, and that will definitely slow down the inflation within the game. But of course, I'd love to hear what you guys think. I always like to kind of look at game economics like this. I think it's an interesting kind of agenda that has developed within the game. But let me know your thoughts, and of course, as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Till then, bye.